have unobstructed views all the way to the Flatirons west of Boulder. So we knew that there was a fire, and I had a bad feeling about it.
We had wind a couple weeks prior, some significant wind events, but really nothing prepared us for that day.
It's the first time in my career after 17 years of getting an all page. So I hopped in my car, I live by St. Mary's Glacier, about an hour drive here. And en route, all of my crew, also off duty, was texting me, asking me if it was the real thing or not. It was the real thing. I said, yes, if you can come in, come in. This is us.
While we were en route, we were on Dillon Road, which gives us a pretty good perspective of the whole Front Range to the west. And it was the biggest plume of smoke that I'd seen in my 25-year career working fire EMS in the Front Range. Wasn't sure what we would be getting into, but fairly nervous with the amount of wind and the strength of the wind that day. But our first structure protection, the wind was still blowing probably 100 miles an hour. We made a plan, but by the time we were going to put that plan into effect, that fire had already ran probably 400 feet. So City of Boulder Wildland crew gave an evac order for us to get out of that neighborhood, and we deployed back north up South Cherryvale Road to a safe zone, and then formulated a new plan.
I had called our operations chief and gave him sort of an update of what it looked like in Louisville, just to give him a little bit of situational awareness. And, as I hung up the phone with that operations chief, Paul Johnson, the EMS chief from Mountain View, called me back and said, hey, Avista, the hospital, is looking to evacuate. They believe that they need to based on either fire impingement or smoke, and I'd like you to go over there and assess the situation. Really turning into the property of Avista, it was so clear to me that what the hospital's emergency manager was saying, Chris Malliard, what he was saying about their need to evacuate, it was absolutely the truth. There was no way that the amount of smoke was going to allow for a productive, safe operations of that hospital.
And that was our first assignment, was to get units over to the Avista Hospital. We needed to start evacuating patients and staff, and we needed to counter the fire that was approaching with wildland-urban interface tactics and kind of set a perimeter and protect that structure. That was our primary focus.
On a typical day, if you're going to transport a neonatal patient, you're going to do it in a single ambulance with a single patient and a lot of providers. Well, it wasn't a typical day. That first ambulance that left, we actually sent 3 babies in that one ambulance with enough providers to care for them, because we didn't know the time, we didn't know the resources that were coming, and we did know that we needed to get them out of there as quickly as possible. So in the midst of the evacuation, I think we had a few of the patients out, maybe 2 or 3 ambulances had left. I got a report from somebody within the hospital saying that there's fire outside of the ICU windows. Literally, they're actually seeing encroaching fire. So at that point, it was, okay, shift gears here a little bit. Yes, we have to continue this hospital evacuation, obviously, but we also have to defend the building and defend our ingress and egress. So at that point, we requested additional fire resources through Broomfield Communications Center, and received essentially what would be a typical amount of resources for a house fire, and started assigning them to try to protect the hospital itself, give us an opportunity to get ambulances in and ambulances out, and to prevent as much destruction to the neighborhood to the north as we could.
They quickly determined that around Avista Hospital, they had enough fire engines for what they were doing at that location, and we were moved to the neighborhood just north of Avista. And our assignment was to try to save homes. And that's what we did for hours. We tried to save homes, but it was the conditions were just unbelievable.
There was no other activity around. That whole neighborhood had been evacuated by law enforcement already. What we saw was pretty incredible. There was approximately 4 or 5 homes that backed up to the open space that were already fully involved in flame. And we were the only engine there that could do anything about it. The unique thing about this situation was while we were standing and holding the line on this one structure trying to protect it, the entire neighborhood was engulfed in flame around us. There you can hear collapses, you can hear transformers exploding, and you can hear other rigs in the distance fighting fire, but you actually couldn't see them because the wind and the smoke was so bad, you can only see 5 or 10 feet in front of you. So it was definitely a challenge.
What I didn't really grasp is that this was going to burn 1,100 homes. We were just doing our job. We were just working. And along the way, I did the best I could to document the houses that we went into. I made sure I knew the addresses and the street names because I fully believed that I was going to go back to an emergency operations center later and say, we saved this one. Unfortunately, we lost these 2. We saved these 3, but we lost this one. I didn't know entire neighborhoods were going to be overrun.
When you see when the fire had picked up, when it had run on a given neighborhood, on a given street, through a given area, there clearly was no stopping that when it was moving. I know that the crews, and having talked to every single person on our fire department and other departments that were there during that afternoon, as I'm driving down from the mountains, they were on the line going for it. It was the most disheartening thing because they were making good progress or making attempts to fortify houses and make stops. And then the weather was just too extreme and it took over, and they'd come back to a house that they thought they had done a pretty good job with, and it would be gone. And everywhere that you looked, there was houses that were on fire or remnants of houses that were on fire, and just firefighters and first responders trying to do their best everywhere. Pretty worn out folks, but still in the fight.
Now it's probably getting to be 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now it's starting to get cold. Things are starting to ice over, and we're just going back and forth in this neighborhood. Now we've got a crew. We've got 2 engine crews and 2 medic crews with us. And we're just going back and forth doing vegetation fires. And all of a sudden we've got a spot fire on the back of a house. Engine 65 made a great stop on that. Was able to save most of that house. There was probably significant smoke damage. And then just back to the other end of the street, 5, 6 houses down. Now we've got more vegetation. There was a resin shed behind a house that had started to ignite. By this point, we had fire crews committed on the other end of the street. We had lost one of our resources to another effort that was a little bit further to the east. And it was just frustrating. We're not on air because we don't have any air. We don't have any backup air. And we're not interior firefighting, but we're still choked with smoke. Embers, storm, and just once it became dark is when it got strange and the wind shifted back the other direction.
Making plans for how to deal with this house, making plans and discussing what their plan is to fall back in the event that that was going to be the case. People starting to ask for water, people asking for fuel, people figuring out where the next sort of likely place was that this was going to be a flare-up, because we were having moments of decreased wind, and we would think that this is the end of the windstorm and this is the end of the thing. We could start putting out these fires, and then the wind would pick up again, and then we'd be back to 80-mile-an-hour winds, and nothing was over yet. And so it was very, very surreal, I should say.
We were actually very thankful. Once the sun went down, the winds actually calmed down as well. And I think we were actually able to finally start getting ahead of the fire, suppressing fires that we couldn't get on top of earlier in the day. So with the cooler temperatures and the wind dying down, that was really our saving grace.
We were able to keep it from crossing to the other side of Spyglass, worked that entire area, but these are houses that it's just after Christmas. And it's completely heartbreaking when you look in the windows and you see, well, there's a Christmas tree and the lights are still on, and there's a kitchen that was just abandoned. There's stuff on the countertops that people fled quickly and evacuated amazingly well, but they left everything behind. And to know that they were going to lose it all was heartbreaking.
About 8 p.m., Engine 67 was instructed to come back to Station 67 to regroup and resupply. And that's what we did. And on the drive back, it's hard to describe because there were fires as far as we could see.
Finally, we ended up on a cul-de-sac downwind from a multi-family complex that was fully involved. We had a good hydrant, we had an escape plan. So we hooked up in the middle of the cul-de-sac there and just did structure protection for about the next 3-4 hours there. So we did make a stop there. The wind at that point had started dying down. Fleet maintenance showed up, refueled our engine. We were all pretty cold and wet at that time. We headed back to Station 66 for a crew swap. And we got back here probably 11:30 or so, midnight. So it was about a 12-hour day that we were gone on the Marshall Fire.
You know, I think that day we had at North, probably north of 90 people from North Metro that were involved in efforts. And some of those people were operated behind the scenes. They weren't actually out, evacuating homes or fighting fires. One of the groups I'd like to talk about, that I don't think people realize what their contribution was our fleet team. They responded into the fire itself to make sure that units were refueled, that they were doing minor repairs on those units during the fire to keep them in the fight. And even before units went out, they were instrumental in getting reserve apparatus ready for backfill people who came in off duty to participate, either running calls in the district or operating at the Marshall Fire.
It's something that I still have to live with because my home is in Superior, and I have neighbors and close friends who lost everything. And miraculously, my own home was spared, but even so, now almost a year later, there are daily reminders about what happened.
I was left with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and with my crew. I recognized, not that we don't recognize this on a regular basis, but I recognized how vital it is to have folks that you trust around you and people that you really care about. And boy, that was a big deal. I feel very, very strongly that was seeing people that are part of North Metro Fire Rescue at some of the most difficult times working at their best is amazing. And I just really relied on that to help me as I was tired and
When we had essentially finished what we were going to evacuate of Good Samaritan, the winds had died down, and the hospital staff decided that they wanted to keep the remaining number of patients in the hospital. So we'd gotten the sickest out, the ICUs, the emergency department patients. Everybody had left, and we were at a point where it was settled, that it was essentially done. I drove back to my house first to see if it was even still there, and just absolutely shocked that it was. In my neighborhood, we lost 150 homes. It was just so fortunate that we didn't lose ours. After that, I went to my parents' house where my wife and my kids were, and it was just sort of a surreal moment of, it's the middle of December, the end of December, in the middle of a pandemic. We just had this massive fire, and unlike anything I've seen since my time in California, and just such an amazing thing to be somewhere safe with the people that you love, but also that little bit of this feeling of, that I'm incredibly fortunate in that moment. Our house is still there, our family is still safe, and knowing that I drove through neighborhoods where that just simply isn't the reality, that so many people lost their homes, animals, people lost their lives, livelihoods are changed. Just such it's just two sides of a coin, I guess. I'm so happy and feeling so fortunate, but at the same time, feeling that sort of pressure of what those other folks are having to go through and will go through for their whole life.
I think overwhelmingly, I'm just proud of our people and the response that we had as an organization, from admin through fleet, to, of course, our first responders, our firefighters that were up fighting the fire in the Marshall Fire or backfilling the district so that we could continue our service to our citizens. You know, it's inspiring to me to be part of that group.